Donald Trump wants generals who are loyal to him, and now the Pentagon is preparing for what could be a major upheaval, according to the Washington Post. Amid fears Donald Trump will at some point follow through with his plans to, quote, deploy the military domestically against American citizens, demand fealty from key leaders, and attempt to remake the nonpartisan institution into one explicitly loyal to him. Joining us now, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense and special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, Mark Jacobson. He's currently president at the Partnership for Public Service. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Katie. Good to be back with you.
So what do you think is going to happen, or what do you worry will happen with the Pentagon?
Well, the first worry I have is that there's a smooth and orderly transition. I mean, this is absolutely critical to national security. We saw in 2001, at least according to the 9/11 Commission report, some of the dangers that can happen when you don't have a smooth transition. You're not ready for all the challenges that are faced out there in a very dangerous world. So I think the first thing that has to happen is the Trump the incoming administration, the Trump team, has to be serious about transition. They have to make sure to get the landing teams in place, and they have to listen to the civil servants and the uniformed military who are going to provide, in an apolitical, nonpartisan way, their best professional judgment on a range of issues that the team's going to have to face when they start on January 20th.
What about the desire for Donald Trump to have generals who are loyal to him, and also the desire that he had at the end of his last term to implement something called Schedule F, which would have gotten rid of anybody who wasn't explicitly loyal to him, making all those appointments instead political and Trumpian in nature? What could he do with the Pentagon if he decides to pursue that?
Whether it's the Pentagon or anywhere else in federal government, I think Schedule F is a problem because it's a blunt instrument. In other words, any president, any secretary of defense, any cabinet official wants a team that helps to implement the president's policies and gets things done. And that's the job of an apolitical civil service, a nonpartisan civil service, and a nonpartisan military, to execute the lawful orders of the commander-in-chief and to make sure those things are implemented. They're political appointees that are going to guide those efforts. So I think any president that thinks that they're going to simply really throw the baby out with the bathwater, we're just going to get rid of everybody who stands in our way, runs into a problem, and that is groupthink. In other words, everyone's going to tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to hear. And I can't think of anywhere where it's more important than the national security arena that people hear, that a president hears what they need to. They need to understand the risks, the trade-offs, there are dangers in using military force, and they're the right ways to go about it. So I'm hopeful that the president brings in a serious national security team that leverages that sort of expertise.
Do you think he's going to have people around him that will get him to stay in NATO? I mean, he just had a conversation with Zelensky that Zelensky says didn't leave him more worried, according to reporting that's out there. Elon Musk also was on that call, according to Axios. But in terms of NATO, which obviously the Ukrainians want to join eventually, do you think that the United States stays in it under Donald Trump?
I think if we take Donald Trump at his word, what he said during the campaign, there is likely going to be shift in U.S. policy towards Ukraine or towards the arming of the Ukrainians. But remember, first, the Europeans are doing a lot, in some cases a lot more than the U.S. has done, in order to make sure the Ukrainians stay in this fight. The second thing, and I'm encouraged by this, is the new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has had a conversation with President-elect Trump, and I think is playing things the right way. A little bit of, look, President Trump, whether you like it or not, his efforts forced the Europeans into a situation where they had to start paying more for defense. Do I worry about the future of the alliance? I do. I worry about the credibility of the U.S. commitment. And I think that if I were advising President Trump, I would tell him to look a bit further, a bit deeper, that it's not just what NATO provides on the surface. It's not a club. It's an organization that has kept the peace in Europe for a long time. And it's an organization that protects U.S. interests as well.
Yeah. And by the way, there was a National Defense Authorization Act in 2024 that included a provision to help protect NATO from the executive. But Donald Trump, if he wanted to get rid of it, he would need 2/3 of the Senate or an act from Congress, which would require both the House and the Senate And it stands to reason that Donald Trump could very much get a Republican House. So that does put NATO certainly at risk if Donald Trump wants to go after it. Mark Jacobson, really appreciate your time, sir. God, it's been a long week. Thank you for joining us.